Chapter 23. Dave leaned back against a small birch tree to catch his breath. Spring was here in the North Country. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds returning from their winter sojourns in warmer climates. Dave closed his eyes. What a winter. He had spent most of it cutting firewood, which he bartered around for the little his family needed. Quite a bit was flat out given to folks who needed it. But he managed to get a milk cow, fodder for the cow, his boys had named her Bossy, a dozen laying hens, a rooster, 12 more Rhode Island red hens for breeding, and enough chicken feed to last a year. Having enough gas to make wood deliveries was an advantage Dave hadn't thought of so long ago. He had a farmer who was going to pay him in a few weeks with a sow and her piglets, which would mean meat through the year. He had also taken the boys hunting, each of them taking small game with their pellet guns and the 22 rifles Dave had for them, both of which were handed down from his uncle. The time spent with the family was the best of all. The boys had accompanied Dave when he had gotten the moose with his trusty old Lee Enfield, and the moose antlers now adorned the wall in the boys' bedroom. Dave's pack contained a fair amount of jerked moose meat, and Dave took pride in the fact that he had prepared to provide for his family in times such as these. Leaves and bark fell down from the birch tree as it was cut by a stream of heavy caliber machine gun bullets. Dave was shaken from his moment of reflection and rolled over, seeking protection of the low tussock that the birch sprouted from. He clicked his push-to-talk button. "Does anyone see that 50? Steve replied, "Yeah, it's down the hill on the road. Kraut's on a 113, meaning an M113 armored personnel carrier." Dave sighed and reached for his Alice pack, releasing the straps that held one of two long olive-drab tubes to its side. Dave pulled the safety pin on the rear of the M136 rocket, cocked it, and uncovered the sights, which popped up with small snapping sounds. Gripping the sling with his left hand, he shouldered the rocket. "How far?" he asked. "About 175 meters, came the terse reply. "I'm going to take it. Cover me." Dave's answer was a sudden cacophony of gunfire from Steve's position, which quickly spread up and down the line of militiamen. Dave rolled to his right and knelt, just his eyes peering over the edge. He heard the 50 firing again, but it was aimed away from him. He raised himself to a crouch high enough for the rocket's fins to clear the earth when he fired, and saw the green and brown camouflage APC downhill and almost straight away from him. Pressing down the safety, he squeezed the trigger, and the rocket launcher belched flame and smoke as it fired its deadly 84mm cargo. Dave saw the red trace element in the back end of the rocket as it streaked downhill and struck the APC's hull directly above the second road wheel. The explosion rocked the track as Dave dropped down, discarded the tube, grabbed his pack, and pulled it away from where he had fired. Tracers crisscrossed the firing point as Dave crawled away. Moments later, the birch tree was toppled as a 40mm grenade from the dismounted ISAF infantry got their act together and returned some effective fire. Dave popped the straps on the other rocket and abandoned his pack. Shouldering the 15-pound package, he high-crawled behind a large oak tree and peered around its trunk. The M113 was in flames, the gunner gone, the 50 pointing straight up from his mount, flames and black smoke billowing from the open hatches. "You're a go at this station," thought Dave to himself as he saw an ISAF trooper kneel a little higher to get off a shot from his G36. Dave snapped his Car-15 up, and the red dot of the aim point sight centered on the man's chest. Dave fired once, twice, and then the man fell over. Dave executed a combat roll to his non-firing side and made haste to another spot. "There's another track coming up the road," an unidentified voice said in his ear. A whoosh boom told him that another AT-4 had found its mark. "Scratch that one," he heard Will say. Dave smiled. Will was doing all right. He had moved into Sam's house shortly after he had turned 18, with her parents' blessing, and they planned to marry next fall. Dave found another tree and did his peek and look. He saw two ISAF troops rushing forward, one carrying a machine gun, another with each hand holding two ammunition cans for the gun. With their Fleck camo, Fritz pattern helmets, and MG3, they looked all of the world like a World War II MG-42 team on the Eastern Front. Dave shot both at a range of about 40 yards with 5 quick shots as a stream of tracers from their own MG3 laid a stream of fire across the German line. The ISAF men were being cut down as the volume of fire from the Americans increased. Dave added his fire to the symphony, changing magazines as fast as they emptied. Suddenly, there were no more targets. "Cease fire, cease fire," came the call up and down the line. Dave's radio crackled. "Red and blue teams, search and clear. White and black, cover. All others withdraw," said the calm voice of Jim. Men and a few women rushed forward, some with pistols and shotguns in hand, their rifles slung. Shots rang out as they approached the bodies. No sense in searching a guy if you weren't sure he was dead. They quickly loaded weapons, ammo, and gear on the ponchos, and by fours returned with their heavy loads. Some were grinning. One unrecognizable camo-painted face went by and said, "Nice shot, Dave." Dave nodded thanks and returned to sweeping his scepter. He cocked his head and stood up and yelled, "Birds inbound! Birds inbound! Move to the rally point, now, all colors!" He heard the cry get passed up the line, and then heard Jim's whistle blow, 3 longs and a short. "Fall back, now!" Dave dropped the rocket, slung his pack, picked up the rocket, and joined the teams in falling back to their prepared positions further in the woods. As they ran, they heard the sound of explosions ripping the tree line as the ISAF Cobra gunships fired their 2.75-inch rockets into the recently abandoned ambush site. Dave stopped as one Cobra swept over them and everyone froze, but the bird was flying straight over them. Dave saw one militiaman fire his MAC-90 at the bird. "Cease fire!" yelled Dave. The man looked at him quizzically. "You stupid SOB, what the F are you doing? Trying to get us all killed? How many times do we have to say it? No shooting at helicopters if they are not shooting at us." The man looked chagrined. Dave was obviously PO'd. "Unload that weapon and help carry a poncho, dumbass," Dave ordered. The man unloaded the rifle, and Dave again took up flight, moving quickly through the sparse brush. Soon they reached the secondary hides. These were prepared bunkers with interlocking fields of fire shaped like a horseshoe. If there were pursuers, they would walk into the horseshoe and take fire from 3 sides. One end of the horseshoe was closed by a water-cooled Maxim, and it was into that bunker that Dave finally slipped into. There were 4 picket bunkers, well camouflaged and hidden. Basically, one-person listening post. They would report enemy movement but would not engage. They were merely early warning posts. Dave settled in with the others in the bunker. 2 of the 3 who had manned the gun during the Chinook ambush. The men nodded to Dave but remained intensely focused on their sector of fire. They were expecting the ISAF to track them and were hoping to thin the herd shortly. The air support didn't surprise them. They had expected it. And the ISAF didn't know, but the free men and women who they faced held all the aces. The ISAF scout ship flew over the scene. "We have 4 burning APCs, and we can see many dead men on the ground. They appear to all be ours," the observer reported. Above him in the command and control ship, the colonel swore. The spring offensive wasn't starting out as he had planned. "Land the QRF and get me more attack helicopters. Alert the reaction company and brigade command. We seem to have found a hornet's nest." "Roger," came the reply. 7 UH-1H Huey helos swept in and quickly disgorged their cargoes of warm bodies into a nearby cornfield. 56 ISAF troops went into a skirmish line as they carefully went over the ambush site. They found no survivors. The passage of the militia was obvious, and the Germans had no trouble tracking them. To their rear, another 4 Hueys landed, and German crews set up 4 81mm mortars under the observation of 5 teams of rebel marksmen. The TA-1 field radio in the position clicked. Dave answered. "Position 1. Dave, LPOP reports as if troops moving in. Have your team wait for the signal." "Gotcha," said Dave. "Guys," he addressed the 2 men, "LPOP reports the Krauts are coming. Wait for the signal." Both men nodded their understanding. The assistant readied several boxes of ammo. Dave opened an ammo can and refilled his ammo pouches with loaded magazines, then took the empty magazines from the front of his shirt and refilled them from stripper clips from yet another can. His pack was in a small pack bunker behind the one he was in. His other rocket was propped up near the entrance of the bunker. Dave shrugged off his LBE, but kept his chest pouch with its 10 magazines on. Drinking from one of his 2 canteens, he shivered as the sweat on his body dried. He thought about getting his polypro top from his pack, but then figured he'd be warm again soon enough. Better to shiver now than to sweat like a dog in a half hour when he might not need to. Up and down the line, militia fighters readied themselves. They had been busy all winter and were now armed with a variety of weapons. There were several long-barreled AKs that had been converted to full auto and were equipped with all of the 70-round drum mags the militia could scrounge. 2 Browning 30s in town were also on the line, as were a large number of fully automatic heavy-barreled ARs and several captured MG3s. The state had provided an additional number of M60s to the town, and the venerable old gun was also represented. The others were armed mostly with ARs and the M4 supplied by the state, and there were a smattering of captured G36s which were becoming a status symbol among the men. The heavy-barreled ARs were supplied with a large number of loaded magazines, and Dave had contributed his 3 Sterling 40-rounders to a heavy-barreled auto rifleman, a 17-year-old fighter. Dave made sure that the gunners had clear fields of fire, and then turned his attention to a long black case on the side of his position. He undid the 4 latches, holding it closed, and looked inside. His Remington 700 PSS lay just as he had left it, its camouflaged green and brown paint showing dully in the darkened pit. He picked it up and opened the action. Using a bore snake, he wiped the bore and loaded 4 rounds of match ammo. Closing the bolter of the top round, he put the safety on and opened the covers on the 10-power Tasco Super Sniper scope. Ensuring that the lenses were clean, he closed them and opened a box of match ammo. He filled the butt cuff with rounds and closed the case. Morton, the assistant gunner, hissed to Dave, "We've got movement." Dave moved to the second firing slit to the right of the gun and peeked out. 3 men in fleck camo were moving in a wedge, spread out about 20 yards, moving quickly but cautiously. Watching through a pair of small binos, Dave noted that they all had full-size G36s, one with a 40mm grenade launcher mounted. They were wearing heavy body armor. All 3 froze behind cover when a Cobra bearing a large black Maltese cross roared overhead. Dave crossed his fingers and hoped that no one would fire at the buzzing Hornet above them. As the sound of the AH-1's turbine faded, the 3 men were up and moving. As they moved beyond Dave's vision, more men came into view, all dressed and armed the same. Moving in fire team wedges, they were staggered, spread from one end of the draw to the other. Dave noted 2 RPG teams. Must be using old East German ones, he mused to himself. Then the command group passed. 2 men armed with G36Ks and with 4 RTOs surrounding them. Also with them were 2 men in GI-BDUs carrying M4 carbines. Dave picked up the TA-1 and pushed the dynamo that will make the phone at the other end ring. Command group passing, sticking out like a sore thumb. When he heard the acknowledgement, he returned the phone to its place and went back to the firing port. When he looked out, the Germans were stopped. At an unseen signal, the men spread out and took up positions behind trees. Dave was startled, even though he was expecting it. The simultaneous detonation of 14 Claymore mines rocked the draw. Almost immediately, the sound of several dozen weapons firing covered the reverberating sounds of the mines. The Germans tried to return fire, but they hadn't a chance. Swept by 6 belt-fed machine guns and over a dozen magazine-fed automatic rifles, the arcs of fire covered all possible hiding spots from at least one angle. In addition, men like Dave were picking off individual targets as they could. The old Maxim next to Dave poured out an almost continuous stream of deadly fire. With water, the gun could fire at its cyclic rate indefinitely without harm. Dave quickly worked through the first 4 rounds in his Remy and ducked down to reload. As he did, the bunker shuddered with the sounds of chopper blades, which shook the ground. The TA-1 was clacking, and Dave wouldn't have noticed except that his head was right next to it. "Maxim," he said. "Dave, we got a Cobra making runs on us. Can you guys get a shot?" "No way." "All right, we'll try something." Dave heard the sound of something being launched in an explosion. Looking through his port, he could hear the Cobra hovering and firing its rockets into the bunker line, but he couldn't see it. Dave stood, the rifle in the corner, and with his Car-15 flopping, went to the bunker's entrance. The Cobra was hovering just above the treetops, and the MGs in the bunkers couldn't bring fire on him. Dave grabbed the AT-4 and at a crouch exited the bunker. Dropping, he crawled over the crest of the hill and then stood up and ran as the Cobra fired another rocket. Following the rocket's path, he saw it hit one of the .30 caliber bunkers directly, logs and dirt flying up in the air. Dave pulled the safety pin as he ran and cocked the rocket. Seeing a clear view, he stopped and backed up. He quickly aimed and fired. At first, he thought the rocket had exploded as he was showered with dirt and debris, and the back of his legs burned. Checking quickly, he realized that he had almost been killed by the backblast from the rocket. Looking up, the Cobra was gone. That ought to keep him away for a few minutes, thought Dave as he dropped the fired rocket tube and raced back to his bunker. Dave returned to see a twisted mass of smoking logs that was the bunker next to his. He ducked into the back Maxim bunker to see Morton dressing a wound on Ernie, the gunner's arm. "We don't have time for that," hollered Dave over the dim. He stepped over Ernie and grabbed the spades. A cluster of Germans was running past to the rear. Dave lit them up, the cocking handle on the right side of the gun making a blurring motion in his peripheral vision. All five dropped in a heap as the devil's paintbrush colored them dead. Ernie came up alongside him and readied another belt of ammo. Dave fired continuously, sweeping the gun from side to side. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire was overwhelmed by the sound of rotor blades. Ernie looked at Dave with fear-filled eyes. "Shite, we're toast now," he said, even as he loaded a fresh belt in the smoking feed block. Dave smiled. "No, I think the cavalry is here." As the echo from a claymore blast reached the little clearing where the mortar crews were waiting, the sniper teams tensed. The Germans quickly scrambled to put rounds downrange. As 4 sets of hands were readying the first of many stacked high-explosive rounds, 5 pairs of trigger fingers tightened. When the sounds of gunfire reached them, the fingers tightened, and 8 of the German crewmen fell. Looking around in confusion, the other Germans had but a moment before 10 more shots rang out. The rest dropped lifelessly to the ground. More shots rang out as riflemen put black-tipped, reloaded armor-piercing rounds through the tubes, and as quickly as that, the teams fell back, melting into the forest. The German security teams near the mortars ran to the men to find most dead and several seriously wounded. Some men fired randomly into the hills around them, but by then the teams were over the crests and safe from direct fire. The air throbbed and the German radio operator picked up his mic to the CO, who tried to contact the choppers on the frequency for air ops. Nothing. He turned as the throbbing got louder and saw a flight of Apaches approaching. He waved to them, and the lead ship with his wing turned towards him. The German captain waved the microphone at the helo, trying to let the idiot know he wasn't on the correct push. "Whiskey lead to Whiskey 2, I have troops in the open, engage on my lead." "Roger. Tom, you got them?" the pilot asked his gunner, who was looking from side to side. "Yeah, some idiot's waving his arms at us." "Light 'em up." Tom's finger tightened on the trigger of his joystick, and the nose-mounted 25mm chain gun roared. The high-explosive rounds chewed up the clearing. He flipped a switch and sent a salvo of FFAR, folding fin aerial rockets, 2.75 inches in diameter, and packing the punch of a 105mm howitzer round into the clearing. The men in the clearing disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. Another salvo from the tail ship rocked the wood line, destroying a German troop truck. The German captain watched in horror as the Apaches fired at his men, the rounds tearing up terrain all around him. "Idiots," he screamed to no one, "we're on your side." His final cry was cut short by fragments from a rocket, his voice dying on the wind as his life bled from him. "Killed by my own men," were his last thoughts. The militia once again swept the field, rounding up wounded men and collecting weapons, ammo, gear, and emptying the pockets of the dead. They captured 7 wounded Germans, 1 wounded American, and 1 American who had not even a single scratch. Following the doctrine of silence, segregate, separate, and speed, the wounded were taken to different areas to be treated, and the American was bound, blindfolded, and led away. After the wounded were stabilized, they would be taken to NHDF HQ for a thorough interrogation. The Americans, too, although they faced the possibility of a firing squad for treason. President Billary announced today a new offensive against the areas of America currently in open defiance of the federal government. President Billary's annoying voice came over the radio. And we will root out the leaders of this movement of open defiance of the controlling national authority and try them for treason. And she had this to say about reports of mass desertion of U.S. military units. These reports are merely propaganda designed to weaken the American people's resolve. These are a few zealots who oppose reasonable gun control, public education, and other progressive programs. It's hard for some to believe that there are so many racist and domestic terrorists out there, but we will root them out and bring them to justice. President Billary's press spokesman, Heather Lyolat, denied rumors that the entire units of the ISAF forces had been destroyed, as reported by the Manchester, New Hampshire Union leader, stating that the Union leader was a known mouthpiece for the, quote, radical right-wing fringe, unquote. She assured America that in the future such irresponsible reporting will be subjected to stronger government oversight. We cannot have people abusing the First Amendment in such an irresponsible manner, spreading fear and untruths, she is reported to have said. In other news, 3 more senators were killed last night as the wave of terrorism continues, bringing to 15 the number killed since the spring offensive began 2 weeks ago. A large number of representatives on the state level have been killed also. A message put out by an organization calling itself the American Terrorist Liberation Organization, or ATLO, has announced that the killings would not stop. They are targeting persons who have in the past supported gun control, the United Nations, the taking of private property for public good, and according to their information, anyone who supports the ISAF presence in the United States and anyone else they consider to be domestic enemies of the Constitution. The FBI is investigating, and Congress will vote today to let the Central Intelligence Agency amend its charter to allow it to operate within the borders of the United States. On to sports.